Hi everyone, I'm Justin. I'm a fifth year architecture student on the NDSU's SOTA Tutor team, and today I thought we'd go over a little introduction to Photoshop. So, what is Photoshop? It's a layer based photo manipulation software. It's based off of making selections to images and making changes to those selections. So for architecture and landscape architecture, this could be used for adding people into renders, making changes to them, adding textures to things. Graphic design is going to be more along the lines of combining images, creating graphics, and complex collages of these images. Another thing to keep in mind is Photoshop is a pixel-based program, so it's raster imagery versus vector imagery. So the more you manipulate an image, let's say make it twice the size, the more distorted it'll become. It'll become more pixelated. So that's one thing you want to keep in mind as far as making large changes to images. Something that's super helpful about Photoshop is knowing the hotkeys. I'll go over the hotkeys as I use them. All of the tools can be found over here. And let's say this is one of the selection tools. You click on it, you can see that it's M as a hotkey. So as you use the tools, you can kind of start to learn the hotkeys as you go. They are super helpful in um, speeding up productivity. Um, Once you get used to it, searching for tools is kind of a pain. Um, Another thing that we'll get into once we start bringing images in is there's tools on Google Image Search that'll help you find large images. And the layers as we go, you'll see that they become super important, keeping track of layers. And I guess I'll talk about these menus over here. So if you don't have any of these, you can find them in Windows. And you can see all of the ones that I have enabled right here. And so as you go, you'll see that they have different, you can add in different menus based on what you're doing. These are kind of the main ones that I use. Um, so like I said, layers are super important. The background layer will always come in locked and white. I recommend just leaving that. As you'll see, things can get real messy real quick in Photoshop. So the more you can leave sort of a grounding layer, the better. And we can add in a new layer here. Um, and I'll get into some of the options of layers in a second. But first, we'll start out with brushes, which you can find right here, or it is B as a hotkey. You come up here, you can see all of the different brushes that you have enabled. Cool thing about brushes is you can start to download brushes, and you can get some of these kind of funky brushes. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Another thing with the preset brushes are, what you'll notice is hard brushes and soft brushes, and you can see the difference. So a hard brush will have a defined edge, whereas a soft brush is sort of that faded edge. Up here, you can change the hardness of a brush. So let's say you have a hard brush and you don't want it quite that hard. You can start to change it here. You can also change the size of it and the orientation of it. So when you get into brushes that are oops, that are direction based, so let's say you have that, and then you come up here, you can actually change the direction of the brush, so it's not all the same based off of what you're trying to achieve. To go back, just Control Z. Um, we'll turn down the size of this brush. So over here you have your colors, and let's just pick black for now. So now that shows up black, and if we had, we'll actually change the color of this white one. So if you have two colors over here, normally black and white are sort of the two primary ones that I use, and you'll see why in just a minute. But if you press X, that'll flip between the two, which is super helpful once you get into things like masks, which we'll talk about in just a bit. Super helpful to switch back and forth between black and white. So we'll just Control Z to get in back to the white background layer. Um, so another thing to be wary about with brushes is the opacity of them. So right now it's at 100%, but we can flip this down to, let's say, 40% or so, and you can see that that affects the brushes as well. So let's go back into a hard brush and so you can see that you can just sort of paint with brushes. Let's get a smaller brush and we'll go back here. Turn opacity all the way up. So another useful thing with brushes, so if you just click and drag, it'll follow your mouse. But if you click and hold shift, it'll draw a straight line. Another thing you can do, let's say if you click here and you want to connect to here, you just hold shift and click and it'll connect the 2 points. And that's about it for brushes. Um, like I said, once you get into sort of downloading some of the different brush packages, you can get things like clouds and trees. You can do some pretty cool stuff with those. I'm going to kind of glance over the eraser tool. So the eraser tool isn't very helpful, and you'll see why once we get into masks. There's a way to sort of delete what you want without permanently deleting it. The eraser tool is going to uh, permanently delete whatever you get rid of. So there's no bringing it back, which in Photoshop um, is sort of a pain. So I guess we'll get into some of the selection tools. So Marquee is well, actually here we'll flip to this as sort of a demonstration of what some of these tools can do. So I'm on Marquee tool, which the hotkey is just M for. And if you click down and hold, you can see that there are different marquee tools. I primarily just use the rectangle one. So let's add. I can get rid of that layer. So let's add a new layer, and this is going to be our sort of base layer, the gray copy, which we'll just rename section cut. And so for the marquee tool, what you can do is make selections. So let's select that. And then with that, everything that you do will now be in this selection. So anything, like if you were to get a brush, you'll see that I can go all the way up and it'll cut off wherever this selection is. Another thing to keep track of, so when you're in the selection tool, there are all of these up here which will determine what you're going to do. So right now I'm on the additive selection, so if I were to draw another box, it would add that to the selection, as opposed to if I take the subtraction one and we'll get rid of what I just added, now we're back to this original. So that's super helpful, especially, so let's just take this, let's go back up to the additive, and we will add this whole bottom part in. And obviously you're going to want to be careful with what you're doing. I'm just trying to get this quickly for demonstration purposes. So let's say we want to make this all black. We'll make this sort of the ground plane. As you can see over here, so if we click X, it'll switch to black. And if we go to Paint Bucket tool, which is G as a hotkey, so we'll press G, and now we're on the Paint Bucket tool. So whatever is selected, if we drop the paint bucket onto it, it'll paint it all that color. So as you can see, we're all black right there. And Control D is deselect, so that'll get rid of your selection box. And one of the other selection tools is going to be your magic wand tools, which is W as a hotkey. Honestly, just the basic magic wand tool is probably your best bet. Some of the things to be aware of up here, your tolerance. So I guess before we get into that, if we just click, as you can see, we're on the section cut layer down here, and so it's selected everything that is this color, which is nice if you're trying to change everything in this, which we will do in just a second. So your tolerance is going to be the difference between what you're selecting and everything on the outside. So if we had 2 for the tolerance, or 200, you can see that 200 just selects everything. So let's go back to 10. Another thing to be wary of is contiguous. So if you are on contiguous, it'll only select the pixels of the same color that are touching. Whereas if you were to turn this off and deselect, now you can see that it selects everything that's the same color no matter if it's touching or not. So what we'll do is deselect that, turn contiguous on, and what we can do then is change the color of this. Add a new layer, and we'll do section line. And grab the paint bucket tool and paint that black. And then just Control D to deselect that. And as you can see now, with layers, we can turn things on and off. Whereas, so with the section down here, this was painted on the base layer. So if we turn that off, it turns the whole thing off. So that's where layers become super important. If you make a change and want to go back, layers are the way to do it. And so now we can get into masks, which I was talking about with erasing things. So if you add a mask down here, which is just this little guy here, it'll add a layer on top of sort of the image or the layer that it's on. And what you can do now is if you're in this layer, everything that you paint black will disappear, and we'll turn off the background layer so we can actually see. So we're still on this mask layer, and if we just paint, we can start to get rid of the background. And the nice thing about it is that you can't do with an eraser tool is if we switch to white over here, we can paint this back. So if we get rid of this and go to a different layer and make changes, let's just go like that, for instance, and go back. Now we can still go back to this mask and paint everything back. So that's super helpful because when you're deleting things, if you delete them, they're just gone. Whereas if you use a mask, they're still in the image, they're just hidden. So if we go to wand tool, what we can do is select all of the outside, and as you can see, some of this won't be selected. So you're going to want to go through and actually take the time to make sure your selection is all the way, what you want selected is all selected. So if we go to G, which is paint bucket, X, which will flip us back to black, we can get rid of the sky here, and Control D for deselect. I mean, you can go through and select things like windows and paint those all black as well. And so one thing that I brought up earlier about sort of finding large images and trying not to stretch an image out more than you have to. One thing that you can do is go to Google Images, and let's say we're looking for a sky to replace the white sky. What you can do is go to Tools and go to Size and Large. So any image that shows up here is going to be a large image. And let's just select this one. This is a nice sky. So if we go to Copy Image and then just go back to Photoshop and add a new layer, and we'll call this Sky. Make sure we're on that layer and paste this in. So this is a huge file, so any sky that I bring in is not going to be larger than the actual canvas size. So what we can do here is do Control T, which is a transform menu, and this is where we can resize images. So if you just grab a corner and resize, it'll just make the whole, it'll keep the proportions of the image. Whereas you press select, you can start to bend and warp the image. And then to get out of this is just a double click. And we can drag this layer below the image. That way it shows up behind the actual image. And this is where you can tell that not everything was selected out. So that's where you'd want to go through and take your time with that. So another selection tool that you can use is this Lasso tool, which is L as a shortcut. If we click on it, we can see that there is a magnetic lasso tool, which you can see if you just click once. It'll make points and sort of follow, similar to the magic wand tool, but this allows you to sort of pick what you want as far as what's being selected. Or there is a polygon tool, which again you just click and you make your own selection, which is super helpful if you're doing things with straight edges. And if we go back to the mask layer, we can paint that black. And again, you can see that that just punches a hole through the image, and we get the sky peeking out over that. Let's see. So another tool that you can use, and I guess we'll just go back to this document for that. So if we draw a marquee box, so right now everything that's selected is in here. So if we go back, still have this selection, but let's say we want to get everything outside of it. To do that, you want to do Shift, Control, and I, which is the inverse, and now you can see that we are on the outside of whatever is selected. So another way to well, here let's go back to Google, and we'll go to Scandinavia. It's a great source for people. So let's say we want to bring this guy in. What we can do is copy the image, go back to Photoshop and paste him in. And we'll click V for the move tool. and that's where you can move everything around. And the nice thing about copying and pasting images in is they'll come in on their own layer. So let's just rename this guy Dude. And you can see that he comes in with this black box. So again, we'll add a mask to it, W for wand, and we'll select everything that's black, and paint bucket, and we'll just get rid of that, and then Control B. And then with this, so let's say you want to resize this guy, you can either use Control T, which is your transform again, and do it that way, or if you're on this, you can go Image, Image Size, and resize it over here. And one thing to keep track of is resample. So resampling something will try to keep the resolution and make changes to the actual image to sort of preserve what's being changed. So let's bring this guy down here. We will Control T to make him, the right height. And then in this Control T, if you right click, this is where you can get some of the different tools. So let's just distort him. So that's where you can sort of get these funky, that's where you can start to transform things. So let's say actually, for example, if we copy and paste this guy back in, something that we can do is we can distort him, and we'll bring him down here. And then if you go to, let's see, is it image, adjustments, and then we'll just go brightness and contrast and turn him all the way down. Or actually, let's go to levels and just make him all the way dark. Then you can start to get him as a shadow, and we'll actually put him underneath so his foot's in front of it. And then with layers and opacity, you can start to turn him down and make him look like an actual shadow. So those are some of the fun things you can do with Photoshop. And I guess, so for examples, I brought up graphic design. So this was created in Photoshop. It was taking a picture that had some text on it and sort of manipulating the text that was there to create letters that weren't. So this is all just a mashup, and unfortunately I don't have the layers of this. But like I said, this is some of the graphic design work that you can get into. And then here is a render that was done through Photoshop. And you can see here's the after image and the before image. And then you can see just how many layers there are in one simple Photoshop doc. So there's not a whole lot that's changed. I mean, you can see that sort of the wood tone over here is different. The fridge is a different color, and there's people in. But this is where I was getting into how important layers are, and some of the more complex things in Photoshop, which we can get into later if you guys are interested, is different maps that you can take from rendering programs. So, for example, here's a material map, and this is how. So, if you turn this off, this is how the different. Oh, I'm on the wrong layer. So this is how the different, or the sort of handles of the cabinetry were painted just by selecting that, and then it's a lot easier than going through and trying to select things. So Photoshop becomes super powerful once you get into things like that, and you can see that there's a whole bunch of different masks that you can download. So for example, here's a sky map that makes it super easy to delete the sky out of an image and then replace it with a sky. So, like I said, those are some of the basic tools that you'll use in Photoshop. If you have any questions about Photoshop, let me know, and we can either work one on one, or I can continue to make some of these videos and get into some of the more complex tools.